What's going on, guys? Mr. Collins here, bringing you episode 4 of my podcast, Let's Talk History. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a dive into the medical mishaps of 2 of our American presidents and seeing how maybe in some cases, if the doctors had just left them alone, they might have been okay. So let's talk history. Okay, guys, I'm joined here in the green screen room with my co-host, Nick. Introduce yourself, Nick.
I'm Nick.
All right, so we're going to talk about some medical mishaps that's happened within the presidency of the United States. So when talking about medical mishaps, the 2 presidents that really came to our minds were George Washington and James Garfield. Both presidents had pretty typical things happen to them, ailments, I guess you could say, and these things could have been prevented in a lot of ways had the doctors just simply left them alone. So, Nick, you want to start us out?
All right. The first one, George Washington, he was born on February 22nd, 1732, and he fought in the French and Indian War, and he also was a general during the independence of America versus Britain. And the way he died is he died on December 14th, 1799, on Mount Vernon, Virginia, and at first it was like the common cold. And then there was a thing called bloodletting back then, where you were sick, they would just drain your blood because they just thought you had bad blood, and that later led to a throat infection, and he then died. And his last words was "'Tis well," and he only served 2 terms, which lasted from 1789 to 1797.
Okay, so Washington, it's honestly just a tragedy what happened to him, because the guy, as Nick stated, he served in the French and Indian War. He'd been a surveyor most of his life. He then took the role as leader of the Patriots in the American Revolution and got them through there. Was such a popular person, and that he was elected first president of the United States. And he served that up until he ran out of his 2 terms. And when he finally stepped down, he really just wanted to go back home. I mean, his dream was to just go back home and spend the rest of his life with his family on his estate in Mount Vernon.
And that obviously didn't happen.
That obviously did not happen because, as Nick said, he got sick just a year or so after. And then the doctors decided to perform bloodletting, which historically has rarely worked. And then he tragically passed away in 1799. So looking at Washington, though, he kind of set the precedent for the rest of the presidents. Just an amazing guy and just one of the best presidents we've ever had. So I want to move and kind of shift a little bit over to James Garfield. So a little bit more of medical mishaps that happened within the presidency. Garfield was president. He became president in 1881. And back then, the inauguration day for presidents was in March. So nowadays it's in January, but back then it was March 4th. So he got inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1881. And it wasn't only about, I believe it was 6 months later as president, a man by the name of Charles Guiteau felt like he had been snubbed a government job by Garfield. So he met him on a train platform and shot him. Now, when Garfield was shot, he was taken back and was tended to by doctors, and he was in some pretty rough shape. I mean, you would be if you were shot.
Yeah, they weren't very sanitary during it.
Absolutely not. You got to remember, and a lot of things that Nick and I are talking about, it seems goofy almost. Like, why would people drain Washington's blood? That seems like a stupid idea. But you got to remember the time. You got to take out your 21st century brain and put in your 18th century brain, 19th century brain. And you got to remember, it wasn't much of a brain when it came to medicine. I mean,
most people weren't even educated. They didn't even know how to read.
Yeah, I mean, if you were reading, you were amongst like the top % of people. So you got to understand that medically, people didn't really understand medicine. I mean, it just wasn't something that was taught, and only your top people, your top doctors in society knew what was going on, and they still don't compare to the doctors that we have today. So Garfield is shot. He's taken back. He's at the White House. He's in the bed, and he is suffering excruciating pain. He starts to get a disease or a infection called gangrene, and it's just festering inside of him. and you had all of the top doctors, top scientists, basically dissecting Garfield, trying to, no gloves whatsoever, dirty hands, probably hadn't washed them, and these people are trying to dissect Garfield to try to extract the bullet that Guiteau had put in him. Now, what most people don't realize is that people like Thomas Edison were living at the same time, and the very first metal detector was created to try to extract the bullet out of Garfield. So what they failed to realize, though, and understand is that Garfield was laying on a metal bed. So no matter where they waved this metal detector, it was beeping, essentially, because they didn't understand just common science like we do today. But they kept poking him, kept prodding him, and eventually it led to him just getting more and more infections and eventually dying. And that's just another example in history of, had they just left Garfield alone, had they just let the bullet be inside him and not operated on him at all, he probably would have lived. He probably, and
maybe just stop the bleeding. That's all they had to do.
Yeah, if they could at least apply pressure, stop the bleeding, and just patch him up, he probably would have survived. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. And I do say unfortunately because Garfield was one of the most educated presidents that we have had in the lineup of presidents. He was very educated. He could speak multiple languages. He could actually write one language with one hand and one language with the other. So he was ambidextrous, super smart. He's almost like the what if president. There's a lot of what ifs in history.
Yeah, so much potential.
Yeah, so he had the potential, and it just leaves you wondering, what if? What if Charles Guiteau had not decided to kill Garfield? Or, even better, what if the doctors just left him alone? But in their minds, they really didn't understand that, had they left him alone, the bullet would probably just rest inside of him and be okay. This has happened before. If you look at a few years later, you got Teddy Roosevelt. He was shot while giving a speech, and I believe the doctors actually just left the bullet in him.
The bullet was still in it. It still went through the speech and everything.
Yeah, went straight through the speech that he had in his pocket. It was a huge speech in his pocket, and he famously said it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. So we could do a whole episode on Teddy Roosevelt alone, and we probably will. But as far as medical mishaps, kind of bringing us full circle again, you can't really talk about medical mishaps within history without talking about Washington and James Garfield.
Oh yeah, what did you say his last name? What last words were?
James Garfield, his last words were, "I do hope it is a mistake." So after the doctors had already been poking, prodding him, prying at him, he actually told everybody, I believe it was to his vice president, Chester Arthur, that he said, "I hope it is a mistake." Basically, that, this has happened to me.
Do you know where he was shot at?
Where, anatomically, where's he shot at?
Yeah, where was the...
I think it was in his back. I believe it was lodged kind of near his
That's what I was
spine.
thinking.
Yeah, I think the bullet was lodged near his spine. And, even working around your spine, that's sketchy territory even today. So the fact that they were doing it back then, it's surprised he lived the time that he did.
How old was he? George Washington was 67, so he got a pretty long life. Since back then the lifespan was pretty low.
Yeah, the lifespan was pretty low. As far as James Garfield, he was born on 1831 and he died in 1881. So I'm sure there's some mathematical equation you could do to find out his age from those two dates, but that I don't know right off the top of my head. So
it would be like 50?
Somewhere around the range of 50. See, they say when you go into history, you don't do math. So, is there anything else you want to add with Washington or Garfield?
No, not really.
Okay. So again, to bring it full circle, medicine has come such a long way throughout history, going from the idea of bloodletting to literally draining the bad blood out of you to where we are today with MRI machines and all these different just over-the-counter medicines you can take. It's another one of those what ifs to think, what if, George Washington just had some aspirin? Or what if James Garfield had some painkillers or something just to soothe the pain? Because in these cases, they certainly did not.
Yeah, there's a lot of infections going. Like if you got cut, it was pretty much, you weren't going to make it.
Yeah, so if you were to get just a minor scrape or something back then, it was a bigger deal than just getting a cut on you like you would today. So in that case, like Nick said, it would be good night John Boy if you were to actually suscept to that. So I believe that's it for this episode. So I thank Nick for joining me again. And I thank you guys for watching. And we'll see you next time in the next episode.